Hello and welcome to the Legal Pause. The Legal Pause is a video podcast series that explores the key issues, challenges and opportunities shaping the legal profession and the charities and partners supporting the profession behind the scenes. Each episode features a conversation between me, Nick Gallagher, I'm the CEO of the Solicitors Charity, plus an invited guest. Guests are always connected to the legal sector in some shape or form, so they may be from the profession or from a partner organisation, but each person offers real insight and a unique perspective. Today's guest is Richard Martin, who is the CEO of the Mindful Business Charter. Now, the Mindful Business Charter, for those of you who don't know, which was formed in 2018, exists as a community of employer organisations aiming to reduce the causes of unnecessary stress, to create healthier, more productive workplaces for all, and to reduce individual stress, which can be a major cause of workplace mental illness. And Richard is a qualified coach and mental health first aider, but his first career was in law in London, and for the best part of 20 years. And he became a senior employment law partner before a serious mental health crisis in 2011 left him in hospital for a month and unable to work for a couple of years. Richard put all of this down in a very, very engaging book called This Too Will Pass, which details the harrowing events leading up to the switch from being a lawyer to a workplace mental health advocate and a wellbeing champion. He also spends his time between Britain and France, where I know, Richard, you've been doing up a house for quite some time, and he's also father to 3 grown-up children. So, Richard, a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have a fascinating story, a very moving story, and I suspect there are many aspects of it that many people will identify with. But why don't we go straight in and talk about that time on the motorway in 2011 where you found yourself in a bit of trouble?
A bit of trouble. Yes. So I'd been, it was a point of time in my career where I was 41, had a big job, lots of responsibilities in my organisation, also had a fairly young family, and was also somebody who said yes to everything. So I was involved in all sorts of things in the community and the kids' school and so on and so forth. And we went away for a week's holiday to the house in France that you mentioned, and I knew that I'd been under a lot of pressure. I felt that, but I kind of thought, well, that goes with the territory, doesn't it? So just crack on, try a bit harder, get through the next day, the next week, the next month, and somehow everything will be a lot better. And we spent the week in France. I spent the week not relaxing and being nice to the kids, but gardening and hacking down brambles and goodness knows what. And we were driving back, and I was driving, we'd got to the périphérique around the edge of Paris. And suddenly I started feeling desperately ill. My heartbeat was out of control, my breathing was out of control, and I felt really nauseous. But more than anything else, my head was screaming at me to escape, to get away from where I was. So I did. I stopped the car amid lots of lanes of fast-moving traffic, got out and walked off. And it was after a little while that somebody in authority kind of saw what was happening, closed the motorway, came and got me and said, "What are you doing?" And in my best French, I said, I don't really know. And I was taken to hospital, slightly comically, because in France they don't have ambulances, the firemen do everything, so I had a bunch of firemen who were kind of looking after me. And they assessed me for a heart attack, because they thought maybe that's what had happened. Concluded I hadn't had a heart attack, sent me home, and said, go and see your cardiologist in the morning, because of course we all have our own cardiologist. But I went to see my GP, and he listened to what had happened, but also a bit about how I'd been feeling in the run up to that, and said, I don't think it's your heart, Richard, I think it's your head. I think what you've had is what we call a panic attack. And this was all new to me. I had a vague awareness of mental health as a thing because of my work as an employment lawyer. And sometimes you'd have clients who would, because of what was happening in their workplaces, it was having an effect on them emotionally. But I didn't know anything more than that, other than to say, look, for certain clients, I think maybe leave me your legal problem, but perhaps go and talk to somebody professional about how it's impacting you. So I had this awareness, but it was always about other people. So when my GP started saying, I think it might be about you, it was all a bit of a shock for me, but also a shock for people around me, because I was this slightly boring, solid, dependable person who always showed up, always, just kept trudging along. And suddenly I was no longer that kind of secure, stable person. And that kind of led to, that led to, within a short space of time, quite a rapid deterioration into extreme anxiety and distress and depression and so on. So within about 3 or 4 weeks, I was admitted to an acute psychiatric ward and spent a month there, just basically existing and gradually understanding a bit more about what had happened and getting to a more stable place where then I could be discharged and carry on my treatment in the community, if you like.
And I think I mentioned that it was 2 years before you were back at work. What did you do in those 2 years? I mean, how did you cope?
So I spent, first of all, my firm, they very kindly kept my position open for me. I didn't end up going back, but they were very kind to do that. I spent quite a lot of time in France, so I did a lot of kind of manual labour, learned how to build things and so on, which was all good in the sense that it was quite mindful and purposeful and absorbing and so on, but it was all very much on my own. And I was, whether I was conscious of it or not, I was avoiding people because people scared me. So then, after a while, I started volunteering one day a week or one afternoon a week in a charity shop. I enrolled on a sort of half a day a week course in psychotherapy and counselling and so on, and gradually just built up activity and built up the confidence to be able to go on public transport, to be able to commit to say, yeah, I will be at a particular place at a particular time, and will engage with whatever happens in that place. And so that sort of slowly built up. And then by the end, but by sort of the middle of 2013, I suppose, I was beginning to think, well, I was doing a psychotherapy and counselling course at Regent's University by this point, which was sort of most weekends. But I was beginning to think about, well, I probably do need to go back to work at some stage. What might that look like? And I was clear that for as long as going back to work meant going back to law, I didn't feel able to do that. The prospect just terrified me. So I was thinking about, well, could I bring my experience of illness? Could I bring the insight from psychotherapy and counselling, both my own treatment but also the learning I'd done, into understanding workplace issues a little differently? So rather than just sort of pouring on a load of law whenever there's a problem, thinking maybe we might understand a little bit more about what's going on in people's heads as to why things happen. And that led to me meeting an organisation called Burndine, who are workplace consultants doing lots of stuff around culture. And it was there really that we started talking about mental health, and that kind of led on to what I do now.
And how did you come across the Mindful Business Charter?
So by 2018, which was when it was launched in October.
So quite a long time after you'd had your crisis.
Yeah, and I'd kind of got a bit of reputation, I think, by that point as being that old lawyer bloke that talks about mental health. And so when the founders, who were all lawyers at that point, it was all law firms or in-house legal teams, when the founders said, look, we're going to need some help in promoting and developing this, would you be interested? I kind of jumped at the chance. And I'd spoken at the launch, so I was kind of aware of it. And then, as I say, a couple of months later, they said, would you be interested in doing some work with it? So and at that stage, it was 12 organisations, 9 law firms, 3 banks. And I started doing it a day a week. And then gradually over the years, that's built up. And as the membership has grown and as what we do to support members has grown.
And I know that this is all about doing business more respectfully and mindfully. And I think you now have over 60 organisations who signed up to be part of what's clearly something of a movement. But what is it that you're actually doing?
140 members. But the um, what are we doing? So I think we do a number of things. So part of it is about spreading the word and encouraging more organisations to be part of the movement. But obviously that's not um, that's a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. And what we do is we try to find different ways in order to support our members in implementing more mindful ways of working, of thinking, and so on. So that might be producing different resources. It might be running webinars and different events. We put a big focus upon sharing, so that if we can learn from each other, if an organisation over here is doing some really great work, well, they'll tell everybody else about it because we can all learn from that. And so we do a lot of work around understanding what different organisations are doing and then getting them to talk to the rest of the community about it. And we'll also get involved in various sort of different initiatives. So, for example, a couple of years back now, we produced some guidance about how to litigate in a more mindful, more respectful way. We did a similar exercise around how to run big projects, big transactions, and how can you do that in a way that is, gets the job done to time, to standard, and so on, but with a bit more respect for the well-being of the people involved. We produced some guidelines a year and a half ago now around, well, how do we go about in a sort of big way managing the psychosocial risks associated with legal practice, understanding what those risks are, and then addressing them. So a broad range of work, and our members are, as I say, it began with law firms in in-house legal teams. We're now broader than that, and we're also, we've moved from being sort of UK focused to having more of an international membership, but our base is still very much in the UK.
And are you seeing? I'm conscious that the Solicitors Charity is the occupational charity for the solicitors profession. There are many of those, surveyors, accountants, all sorts of professional bodies, gardeners, chemists. We see quite a lot of similarities in the kind of help that people come to us, the kind of need that people have. Are you seeing similarities or differences between the different professions that are part of the MBC, and indeed, are you seeing differences or similarities internationally?
So if I take the international piece first, I think there are very definitely cultural differences in different parts of the world, and that might be perhaps that certain countries in Europe have got a greater respect for individual health and well-being, and therefore have got a better sense of kind of quality of life or work-life balance. And so perhaps have less demanding workplace environments, less demanding professions. And then there are other parts of the world where, for example, the conversation around mental health is not nearly as advanced as it is in the UK, and or where there might be a kind of cultural heritage, I suppose, of incessant client service, of doing whatever your customer wants and so on, and obviously that doesn't help. And we obviously, we're at a time where in the US there's a bit of a pushback against various different kind of workplace initiatives, and I think possibly well-being, mental health might fall as part of that broader piece, which means that we probably have to focus a bit more on performance as opposed to health when we're talking to folk in different parts of the world. For us, we've always thought about those two things as going hand in hand, that if we're healthy, we can perform better. But as I say, perhaps in the US, we need to be focusing a bit more on the performance aspect of that at the moment. But in terms of other professions, yes, I mean, I think there are very definitely similarities in across a number of different professions, and one can look at things like the accountancy profession, consulting, parts of financial services and so on, where perhaps the pressures and demands are quite similar to law. But even then there are differences. So if I think about financial services, perhaps the speed of things is something that is a different thing, and perhaps the magnitude of some of the amounts involved is a different thing. But then you look at, I know that vets, for example, have a very high rate of mental illness. And my understanding of that, I've not studied the veterinary profession, but my understanding of that is that vets will often work on their own, and that isolation is a contributing factor. Obviously medicine, doctors, nurses, they have high levels of mental illness, and I'm sure that's down to the pressures, the importance of their work, and also the nature of what they're dealing with. And I think that's one of the things that we in law have never really thought about properly. Is not everybody, obviously, in law, but a lot of people in law are dealing with, on a fairly regular basis, some pretty harrowing content in their work, whether that's medical negligence cases, road accidents, family disputes, abuse, whatever it might be, crime of different kind. That's, some of that subject matter is really hard, and we've never really thought about what do we need to do as a profession to look after the people who are dealing with it.
And of course, it's such a varied profession. I mean, everything from the huge corporates to the sole practitioner, people involved in family law with some very harrowing, emotive cases as well. But the members of the MBC, what do they say about what the MBC achieves and what it helps them to do?
It's an interesting question. And I can answer that in different ways. MBC is funded by its members, and we renew all our members each September. The fact that the vast majority of them renew every year tells me something. We try and have a regular dialogue with members to understand what they need, what we can do to support them, and so on. We don't always get huge amounts of feedback. I think that's the nature of this sort of organisation. We're sort of pushing or trying to push people, and but then we'll have at any one time a lot of different consultation exercises and different things that we're doing, and then you hear people say, "Oh no, that's really useful. We use that all the time, and this has been really instrumental." And you think, "Oh, okay, well, brilliant. I didn't know that, but that's fantastic." But we're conscious that if we think about what our greater purpose is to create healthier, more effective ways of working and reduce the unnecessary sources of stress that people experience, we can't do that on our own. We can put in place understanding, we can put in place resources, we can do training and all sorts of other things. But at the end of the day, it depends upon people in their individual workplaces implementing that stuff. And that's so. We're always conscious of the fact that we're one step removed from the sort of the front line, if you like, which is a challenge. But it also means that when the world hasn't become a much better place over the 8 years that we've been in operation, it's not all down to us.
Just thinking about your situation and what you were just saying about the differences in experiences in different countries, and perhaps as having a very particular culture in the UK. I mean, I know you've talked about being somebody who, you had patterns of behaviours and habits that were formed in childhood. You wanted to be a good boy, you wanted to please, lots of learned behaviours like that. Do you think that the way that the legal profession in the UK has operated means that it didn't really fit with somebody with your sort of character?
So I'll answer that in different ways. So one of the first things I read when I was ill that was kind of helpful was a book called Depressive Illness, The Curse of the Strong by a psychiatrist called Tim Cantifer. And he's talking about what we would now call burnout. But very early on in the book, he says, when I first used to see patients with burnout, the first thing I would do is I would talk to them and find out what they were like, get a sense of their personality. He says I don't bother anymore because I know what they're like, people who experience burnout. They are all the same. And then he lists a number of characteristics. And he talks about moral strength, reliability, diligence, strong conscience, a strong sense of responsibility, a tendency to focus on the needs of others before your own, sensitivity, vulnerability to criticism, and self-esteem dependent upon the evaluation of others. And when I first read that list, I thought, but that's everyone I know in law or professional services. I mean, and what he says is, it's not surprising that these are the people who end up getting ill because these people don't say no. These people, when the going gets tough, they don't ask for help or they don't give up. They just crack on and work a bit harder. And generally speaking, it works until it doesn't. And I think there is a debate about whether, when one looks at lawyer personality types, how much of it is kind of what they bring to the law and how much of it is what law does to them, if that makes sense. But, those characteristics that Cantor was talking about, we love those people. Those are the people we recruit, we promote, we turn to when the going gets tough because, they're great people. I do think there's been a change over the last several decades, because I think there was a time. Well, let me take an example. If I need a plumber, I will phone up my plumber, and my plumber will say, well, I can fit you in a week next Thursday. And unless it's really urgent and you have to go and find another plumber, well, you go with that. There was a time when I think lawyers used to feel a little bit more on a level with their clients. Whereas now I think it feels less balanced. There's more of a subservience. People talk to me about, Richard, you have to understand we're at the mercy of our clients. I think, ooh, listen to that language. And I don't say that that's universal and so on, but I do think that's been a shift, and I think that's partly why we have significantly higher levels of distress now than we might have had some time ago. It's not a new thing, but I think it's a growing issue.
So is that connected to the way that business has changed? So much of it now being done by email, social media, criticism of firms very public criticism if they don't get things right.
I'm sure that's right. The speed of things and so on. The promise that technology would make our lives easier obviously has not borne out as true, and all it's done is speed things up and made us have to do more. I sometimes think back to when I first started work, and it wasn't that long ago, and I didn't have a computer. I had a phone on my desk, but the only people with that number were switchboard and my wife. Nowadays, people are carrying around a phone in their pocket, which all of their clients have the number for. They're available 24/7 if they allow themselves to be. And whilst on the one hand that can feel like great client service and so on, and I'm sure clients are grateful for that, it also means you can never switch off. Even if you're not answering the phone at any particular time, the fact that you might have to means that you're always sort of on call and so on, and I'm not sure that's healthy.
Yeah. Just going back to the Peripherique in 2011, I mean, you had some very significant signs that things were not right. But if lawyers are likely to suffer burnout, what sort of signs should they be looking for in themselves? What are the early warning signs?
The biggest overall thing, I think, is change. People don't change without a reason. So if you're noticing a change in yourself or somebody else, then be curious as to why. It might not be about mental health issues, it might be about all sorts of different things, but let's ask the question. Particular things, problems with sleep, that might be a good indicator. Relationship problems, which might be, if for example, you're not finding the time or the energy to invest in key relationships in your life. If you're finding that you're never having time to switch off, never having time to slow down. More irritable with people, that might be a good indicator. Physical issues, so that might be regularly picking up infections of different kinds because your body's just run down and it's not able to fight stuff. It might be losing weight, it might be gaining weight, not finding time for the things that you enjoy. But Richard, you used to love doing whatever. When was the last time you did that? Yeah. And then there are, I remember when, I don't know if I can say this on the Solicitors Charity podcast, but I'll give it a go. When my doctor was first sort of giving me a list of symptoms, one of the things he said was urinary frequency, I think was the term he used. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've been weeing all the time. I just never knew that that was a symptom. So
It's
there are
not just
lots
to be
of different.
60-year-old men then, Richard.
But yeah, so there's a range of different things, but I think change is the biggest one.
And it sounded from the way that you started to describe all of those signs as though possibly these are things that colleagues should be looking out for in their peers. Do you think there's a role for us all to play in this?
I definitely. We know that the law is a high stakes game. People work very hard, long hours, and so on and so forth, and that is not going to change. But in that environment where we are, definitely testing people, we're putting them, up against a lot of pressure and so on. I think. I absolutely think there's a role. I think it's incumbent on us all actually to be looking out for each other and be thinking, okay, so how is Nick today? And I would say, ideally, not just in our own organisations as well. If you're my client, or if you're on the other side of a transaction or a piece of litigation, it would be nice to think that we could re-establish that sense of a profession where we are looking out for each other.
So how do you strike a balance between the humane and the professional? Yeah, I can imagine people saying, well, it's not very professional to comment on your client. This is a business transactional. How do you balance those things out, do you think?
So I think there is sometimes it's about asking permission to say, look, I know you've come to me for some employment law advice, for example, but could I just talk to you about its impact upon you? And if they are happy to engage in that conversation, then fine. If they're not, then okay. And I think, and that permission piece is a thing that we talk about a lot at NBC, that the idea at the heart of it is that we've got permission to ask for what we need and what we don't need in order to do our best quality work and so on. And perhaps within that too, we have the permission, well, obviously within that, we have the permission to talk about how we're feeling. And that therefore, when you do ask me, I know that it's coming from a good place. I don't need to take offence, and I can answer you. I can choose not to if I don't want to, but I'll know that my organisation is one in which I can talk about the fact I might be finding it hard without worrying about the implications of that.
And I'm just reflecting on all that you've said, and the professional life of a solicitor is hard, but also solicitors are human beings. All sorts of things can happen in their lives. As you know, we think at the Solicitors Charity about our 4 pillars of wellbeing, which are the mental and emotional pillar, the professional, the physical wellbeing, and the financial wellbeing. But all of those can weave in to drive unwell-being, in a rather inelegant phrase, but they can all fit together. But we're here to help people get through those difficult times and to get to a place where they're better able to cope. You started talking about those 2 years after you first became really ill, when you were doing lots of manual things and that. But you've got a sort of well-being routine, I think. There are certain things you do for your well-being. Tell us a little bit about those.
Well, and just before I do that, coming back to what you were saying, I think all of those, you all know this, but all of those pillars very much overlap, because if I am struggling, for example, with my mental health, well, then that might well have an impact upon my relationships. It might well have an impact upon my work. I know that insurers that we talk to are increasingly looking at the link between poor mental health and mistakes, but also not just mistakes, poor ethical judgments and things like that. And equally, inevitably, that can have a knock-on effect on financial well-being as well. So I definitely see all of those as being very much linked. I have a dog, so and if I don't walk my dog, then he doesn't get cross, but he gets quite impatient. So every morning I will get up and walk my dog, And it's one of these things that there's no doubt about it. I don't have to stop and think, oh, shall I go for a walk today or not? It's just part of every day. And so apart from, when I really have to be in London early, that's just the first thing that happens every day, which means I have an hour of exercise, I have an hour in nature, I have an hour without my phone, I have an hour without being, without having to answer to anybody or whatever, which is lovely. I do lots of DIY type stuff, so I enjoy doing woodwork, I enjoy getting involved in the garden and so on.
Will the house in France ever be finished?
I very much doubt it. I keep finding new things that we might try and do. I'm currently learning how to build a limestone wall, which I never thought I would get involved with. And it is funny how we, in all sorts of ways, I think as lawyers, there's a tendency for us to limit ourselves. So that might be in the nature of the work we do. As we become more senior, we become more specialised and so on, and so we narrow down what we can do. But I remember when I was first sort of embarking, I wasn't meaning to embark on any building work in France. I spoke to a guy down the road to say, could you build me a wall? He was a builder. He said, no. I said, sorry. I'll pay you and all that. He said, now you can do that. And I remember saying to him, no, I can't. I'm a lawyer. I've got tiny soft hands. I don't do this. And he sort of got me to do it. And you think, oh, okay, so I can do this stuff. I might not do it very well, but I can do it. And if I can do that, well, then I can maybe have a go at something else and so on. And then you end up with things that are of interest and are on your mind, but on your mind in a good way, that are not about clients or work or whatever.
Yeah. And quite by chance, you and one of our recent guests, Mark Evans, president of the Law Society, a couple of blokes. Do you think men are getting better at engaging with these problems? Because we notice that we still have a much higher level of women coming to us for help at the Solicitors Charity than men. Do you think that's improving? Are men learning to say it's okay not to be okay?
I think they are. And I think there have been a lot of really important kind of role models for that. I still think, I still very much think that there is a way to go. But I'll give you two stories. And when I was in hospital on the first day, the sort of nurse that was checking me in gave me the programme for the week and said, and on Wednesday at 11 o'clock, there's a men's support group. And I remember thinking, that's not going to happen, is it? But what happened was we all went into the room, and the nature of a community in a hospital like that is that there are people who've been there for a while and some like me who just arrived. And the people who've been there for a while show the way, and they talk about their emotions and stuff, and you realise, oh, so we can do this, and we can do this safely and so on. And before you know it, as time has moved on, you're the person that's the most senior, and you're showing the way to other people without consciously doing that. But I remember so we do an event at NBC every it's in the autumn normally. And in 2019, we were being hosted by Simmons & Simmons. And the guy who was our kind of host for the evening, I was expecting him to stand up and say, welcome to Simmons, lovely to have you here, the fire exits are at the back and so on, and now I'll pass over to Richard. He was slightly late in starting, and he said, I'm sorry for being slightly late in starting, but I suddenly realised about 10 minutes ago that I needed to say something else. And so I needed to talk to my colleagues and so on before I did it. And then he talked about his experiences of mental illness in the past and his recovery and so on. And it was extraordinary. And you think, oh my goodness, where did that come from? That's the first time you've spoken publicly about this, and you're being incredibly brave. And so it is happening. And I think, I don't want to be overly generational about it, because I don't think it is just a generational thing, but we do know that younger people in our workplaces tend to be more willing to talk about how they're feeling, and also to prioritise that, and to say, well, I'm not going to do things that are going to make me feel unwell. Yeah,
and that's encouraging. And we are seeing a huge increase in the number of people who are coming to us for help. I can only encourage more people to do so. There is help out there. There is us, there is Law Care, the helplines at the Law Society will provide help in a whole range of areas.
And the first conversation, I think, is the difficult one. The one where you have that courage to ask for help. That first time, and once you've taken that step, it becomes easier.
So, just to end the podcast, a reminder of the 4 R's you can action to show your support for the Solicitors Charity. Please do reach out and encourage others to do so if help's needed. We offer confidential, discreet and independent help. Remember RCBs, unclaimed balances. Much of our income comes from this source, and it's a really important part of our funding. Register with us for regular updates. We'll email you with news of interest. And react to our stories and news on LinkedIn and social media. The more followers we get, the more impressions of posts, the more reach we get, the more people will know we're out there and that we're here to help. Richard, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being so frank and open.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you guys do at the Solicitors Charity.